exposing the hospital's dark past, the terrifying truth you never knew. Winterfell was a town steeped in history, with cobblestone streets and age-old buildings that whispered tales of the past. Located in a remote corner of England, it was a place where the fog rolled in thick from the sea, wrapping the town in a shroud of mystery. It was here that Winterfell Hospital stood, a towering structure that had long been a source of both comfort and fear for the townsfolk. Ethan Moore had always felt uneasy about Winterfell Hospital. It wasn't just the cold, sterile air or the echoing silence that filled its halls. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at him every time he stepped through its doors. But he had no choice. His older brother, Liam, had been a patient there for nearly 6 months, and Ethan's visits were his only connection to the brother he once knew. Liam had always been the strong one, the protector. But something had changed after their parents' divorce and their father's sudden death. Liam had begun to withdraw, to speak in hushed tones about things that no one else could see or hear. Eventually, his behavior became too erratic, too dangerous, and the decision was made to admit him to Winterfell Hospital's psychiatric ward. Ethan had resisted at first. He hated the idea of Liam being locked away, surrounded by strangers who saw him as nothing more than a case file. But there was nothing he could do. At 17, Ethan was still in school, struggling to keep his grades up while dealing with the weight of everything that had happened. He had no power, no voice in the matter. So, every Friday after school, Ethan would make the long walk to Winterfell Hospital. The path took him through the town's old cemetery, where the tombstones leaned at odd angles, their inscriptions worn away by time. It was a shortcut, but one that always left him with a sense of foreboding. The hospital loomed ahead, its stone facade darkened by centuries of weather. The building was massive, with wings that stretched out like the arms of a specter, eager to pull in anyone who dared come close. As Ethan approached, he could see the soft glow of lights through the windows, but it did nothing to dispel the gloom that surrounded the place. Inside, the hospital was just as cold and unwelcoming as the exterior suggested. The floors were polished to a gleam, but the light from the overhead fixtures was harsh, casting long shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of Ethan's eye. He ignored them, focusing instead on the task at hand. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a tight bun and a stern expression, barely looked up as Ethan signed in. She handed him a visitor's pass with a nod, her eyes never leaving the screen of her computer. "He's in his room," she said, her voice flat and devoid of any warmth. Ethan mumbled his thanks and headed down the corridor. The psychiatric ward was located in the East Wing, a part of the hospital that always seemed colder than the rest. As he walked, his footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent hallway. He passed by several rooms, each door closed and marked only by a number. Occasionally, he would catch a glimpse of movement through the small windows, patients sitting alone in their rooms, staring blankly at the walls or rocking back and forth in their beds. It was a sight that never failed to send a chill down his spine. Finally, he reached Liam's room at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and Ethan hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room was small, with just enough space for a bed, a knit stand, and a chair. The walls were a drab institutional gray, and the single window was barred, allowing only a sliver of light to filter through. Liam was sitting on the bed, his back to the door, staring out the window as if he could see something beyond the iron bars. "Liam," Ethan called softly, stepping inside. Liam didn't respond. He continued to stare out the window, his hands resting limply in his lap. Ethan closed the door behind him and approached his brother, his heart sinking at the sight of how thin and pale Liam had become. "Liam," he said again, this time placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. Liam flinched at the touch, turning his head slowly to look at Ethan. His eyes were dark, hollow, as if the light inside him had been extinguished. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice raspy and weak. Ethan forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, how are you feeling?" Liam didn't answer. Instead, he looked past Ethan, his gaze fixed on something just beyond the door. Ethan glanced back, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway. "They're watching me," Liam said suddenly, his voice barely audible. Ethan frowned. "Who, the doctors?" Liam shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "No, not them, the others. They're always watching, waiting for me to let my guard down." Ethan felt a cold knot of anxiety form in his stomach. "Liam, there's no one there. You're safe here." But Liam wasn't listening. He was muttering to himself now, his words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed stream. Ethan caught snippets, something about shadows, whispers in the dark, and a place where the light could never reach. Ethan knew better than to try and make sense of it. He had learned over the past few months that arguing with Liam when he was like this only made things worse. Instead, he sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to steer the conversation toward safer ground. "Have you been eating well? You look thinner." Liam stopped muttering and turned to Ethan, his expression suddenly blank. "I can't eat. They won't let me." Ethan's heart ached for his brother. He wanted to help, to do something that would make this nightmare go away. But all he could do was sit there, helpless, as Liam's mind continued to unravel before his eyes. Eventually, the conversation petered out, and Liam returned to his silent vigil at the window. Ethan stayed for as long as he could, but as the minutes dragged on, the oppressive atmosphere of the room became too much to bear. "I'll be back next week," he said, standing up and giving Liam's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Liam didn't respond. He simply stared out the window, his eyes unfocused, lost in a world that Ethan couldn't reach. As Ethan left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The hospital had always made him uneasy, but this was different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of impending doom that clung to him even as he stepped out into the cold evening air. The walk home was long and lonely, the shadows stretching out behind him like dark, grasping fingers. Ethan couldn't help but glance over his shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see someone or something following him. But the street was empty, and the only sound was the soft crunch of his footsteps on the gravel path. Still, the feeling of being watched refused to leave him, and by the time he reached the safety of his home, he was trembling. He locked the door behind him and leaned against it, trying to calm his racing heart. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Ethan knew he wouldn't be able to sleep that night, not with the memories of Liam's haunted eyes and the suffocating atmosphere of Winterfell Hospital fresh in his mind. He spent the night sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness, wondering what had become of his brother and what dark secrets Winterfell Hospital was hiding. The days following Ethan's visit to Winterfell Hospital were filled with annoying unease. At school, he found it hard to focus on his classes, his mind constantly drifting back to Liam's hollow eyes and the strange things he had said. The hospital had always been a place of discomfort for Ethan, but this time it felt as if something had followed him home, a shadow that lingered in the corners of his thoughts. Sarah Collins noticed the change in Ethan almost immediately. She had been friends with him for as long as she could remember, and though he wasn't always the most talkative, he had never been this withdrawn. She found him one morning standing by his locker, staring blankly at the rows of textbooks inside, seemingly oblivious to the bustle of students around him. "Hey, Ethan," Sarah said, nudging his shoulder gently. Ethan blinked, snapping out of his trance. "Oh, hey Sarah, you okay? You seem off." He sighed, leaning back against the locker. "It's just my brother. I went to see him at the hospital, and I don't know, something's not right." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean, is he getting worse?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how much he should share. It's hard to explain. He was talking about things watching him, shadows, whispers, and when I left, I just had this feeling that something bad was going to happen. Sarah nodded slowly. It must be tough seeing him like that. But Ethan, you know that hospital's not exactly a happy place. It's probably just getting to you. Maybe, Ethan conceded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. But there's more. I found his doctor, Dr. White, tied up in his room. She said Liam attacked her and escaped. Sarah's eyes widened. He escaped? Where did he go? She doesn't know. That's the thing no one seems to know. And she was more concerned about covering it up than finding him. That's really weird, Sarah admitted. But maybe they don't want to cause a panic or something. Hospitals are pretty strict about their reputations. Yeah, but it doesn't sit right with me, Ethan said, his voice laced with frustration. I should have done more, stayed longer. I don't know. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Ethan, it's not your fault. You can't be expected to fix everything, but maybe we can figure this out together. Ethan looked at her, surprised by her offer. You'd help me, of course. That's what friends are for, right? Sarah smiled, though her eyes held a hint of concern. We can go back to the hospital, maybe ask around, see if anyone knows anything. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude. Thanks, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you. Don't mention it, she said lightly. Just promise me you won't go getting yourself into trouble. Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was already on its way, whether he wanted it or not. That evening, after the final bell rang, Ethan and Sarah made their way to Winterfell Hospital. The sky was overcast, a blanket of thick gray clouds that threatened rain, adding to the already oppressive atmosphere. As they approached the hospital, the towering structure seemed to loom even larger, its dark windows like empty eyes staring down at them. Inside, the hospital was as cold and unwelcoming as ever. The receptionist gave them a brief glance before returning to her work, clearly uninterested in why two teenagers were there after hours. Ethan led Sarah down the familiar corridor toward Liam's room, his heart pounding in his chest. The door to Liam's room was closed, but when Ethan pushed it open, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, and there was no sign that anyone had been there since his last visit. Are you sure this is the right room? Sarah asked, peering inside. Positive, Ethan replied, his brow furrowing in confusion. But it looks like they cleared everything out. Maybe they moved him to another room, Sarah suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Maybe, Ethan muttered, though deep down he knew that wasn't the case. The hospital staff had been evasive when he asked about Liam earlier, offering only vague reassurances that they were doing everything they could to find him. As they turned to leave, Ethan noticed something out of the corner of his eye. There was a piece of paper sticking out from under the bed. He knelt down and pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw what it was. It was one of Liam's drawings. Liam had always been an artist, even when they were kids. He would spend hours sketching, creating intricate and detailed pictures that often reflected his inner thoughts. But this drawing was different. It was dark, chaotic, filled with jagged lines and twisted shapes. In the center was a figure, almost human but distorted, its eyes black holes that seemed to stare back at Ethan. Ethan showed the drawing to Sarah, who frowned as she studied it. This is unsettling. Do you think Liam drew this? Yeah, it's his style, Ethan said, his voice tight with worry. But he never drew anything like this before. Maybe it's a clue, Sarah suggested, though her tone was uncertain. Maybe he's trying to tell us something. Ethan stared at the drawing, his mind racing. If he left this here, it means he was here after Dr. White was found. But why would he come back, and where did he go? Good questions, Sarah said, glancing around the room. But I don't think we're going to find the answers here. Reluctantly, Ethan folded the drawing and slipped it into his pocket. "You're right. Let's check out some of the other rooms. Maybe we'll find something else." They spent the next hour exploring the East Wing, peering into rooms and trying to avoid the attention of the hospital staff. Most of the rooms were empty, their doors locked, but a few were occupied by patients who either ignored them or watched them with vacant, disinterested eyes. As they were about to give up, they came across a room at the very end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and a dim light filtered through the crack. Ethan pushed the door open cautiously, revealing a small, cluttered office. Papers were strewn across the desk, and shelves lined the walls filled with thick, dusty books. "Is this a doctor's office?" Sarah whispered. "Looks like it," Ethan replied, stepping inside. "But why is it back here, away from the main area?" He began to sift through the papers on the desk, his curiosity piqued. Most of the documents were medical records, but one file caught his eye. It was labeled with a single word, *Project Nightfall*. Ethan opened the file, revealing a stack of old, yellowed papers. The first page was a list of names, followed by a series of gates. As he flipped through the pages, he realized that the names were all patients who had been admitted to the hospital over the years. But what stood out to him was that many of the names had been crossed out, and beside them, someone had written the word transferred. "Transferred," Ethan murmured. "But where?" Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the list. "These dates go back decades. Some of these patients must have been here a long time ago." "Exactly," Ethan said, flipping to the last page. "And look, Liam's name isn't on here, so this has nothing to do with him." Sarah asked, sounding both relieved and disappointed. "Maybe not directly," Ethan said, his mind racing. "But if these patients were transferred somewhere, maybe Liam was too. Maybe they did something to him." Sarah frowned. "Like what?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "But this place ... it gives me the creeps. What if there's more going on here than we realize?" Before Sarah could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway. They both froze, their hearts pounding as the sound grew louder. Someone was coming. Ethan quickly stuffed the file back into the drawer and motioned for Sarah to follow him. They slipped out of the office and ducked into a nearby supply closet, just as a shadow passed by the doorway. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, Ethan was sure they had been caught. But then the footsteps resumed, fading away into the distance. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That was close. Too close," Sarah whispered. "We should get out of here before we get caught." Ethan nodded, and they quietly made their way back to the entrance. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they had uncovered something important, something dangerous. "We need to figure out what Project Nightfall is," he said as they walked away from the hospital. "It might be the key to finding Liam." Sarah agreed, though her expression was troubled. "But be careful, Ethan. Whatever this is, it feels wrong. Like we're digging into something we shouldn't." Ethan knew she was right, but he also knew that he couldn't stop now. Not when Liam's life might be at stake. Over the next few days, Ethan and Sarah threw themselves into researching Winterfell Hospital and Project Nightfall *. They spent hours in the town's library combing through old newspapers, medical journals, and any other records they could find. It was a daunting task, made even more difficult by the fact that much of the hospital's history seemed to have been deliberately obscured. Winterfell itself had a long and somewhat dark past. The town had been established in the late 1800s, originally as a small fishing village. But over the years it had grown, and with growth came the need for a hospital. Winterfell Hospital was built in the early 1900s, and from the beginning it had been shrouded in mystery. There were rumors of strange experiments, unexplained deaths, and patients who simply vanished without a trace. But what intrigued Ethan and Sarah the most was the recurring mention of a man named Dr. Alistair Blackwood. Dr. Blackwood had been one of the hospital's leading physicians in the 1930s and 1940s, known for his pioneering work in psychiatry. But he was also a controversial figure, rumored to have been involved in unethical experiments on his patients. Many of these experiments were never documented, and those that were had been sealed away, hidden from the public eye. As they dug deeper, Ethan and Sarah found references to Project Nightfall in a few obscure medical journals from the 1940s. The articles were vague, filled with medical jargon that was difficult to decipher, but they alluded to a project aimed at exploring the boundaries of the human mind and unlocking the secrets of consciousness. The project had been shut down abruptly in the late 1940s, and all records of it had been sealed. But what stood out to Ethan was that the project had been conducted at Winterfell Hospital under the supervision of Dr. Blackwood. "This has to be it," Ethan said one afternoon as they pored over another stack of old newspapers. Whatever they were doing with Project Nightfall it must be connected to Liam's disappearance. "But how?" Sarah asked, rubbing her tired eyes. "That was over 70 years ago. How could something that old be connected to what's happening now?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "But maybe the hospital never really stopped. Maybe they've been continuing the experiments in secret." "That sounds like something out of a horror movie," Sarah said, though her tone was serious. "But if you're right, then we're dealing with something way bigger than just finding Liam." Ethan nodded, a sense of dread settling over him. "I know, but I can't just walk away. I need to know what happened to him." Sarah reached out and took his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll figure this out, Ethan, together." As they continued their investigation, Ethan and Sarah decided it was time to return to Winterfell Hospital. But this time, they would go at night, when the hospital was at its most quiet and vulnerable. They knew it was risky, but they also knew that if they wanted to find out the truth, they had to take that risk. The night they chose was cold and clear, with a full moon casting an eerie glow over the town. They dressed in dark clothing and brought flashlights, knowing that they would need to be as stealthy as possible. When they arrived at the hospital, the building was dark, save for a few lights in the windows. The main entrance was locked, but Ethan had come prepared with a small set of lockpicking tools he had borrowed from a friend. After a few tense moments, he managed to unlock the door, and they slipped inside. The hospital was even more unnerving at night. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. The air was cold, and their breath came out in white puffs as they made their way down the corridor. They headed straight for the East Wing, where they had found the office and the file on Project Nightfall But when they arrived, they found the door to the office locked, and no amount of picking could get it open. "Looks like someone doesn't want us snooping around," Sarah whispered. Ethan nodded, frustration gnawing at him. "We'll have to find another way in." They decided to explore the rest of the wing, hoping to find another entrance or perhaps some other clue that might lead them to the answers they sought. As they moved deeper into the hospital, the atmosphere grew more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. It was Sarah who first noticed the strange smell and earthy, musty odor that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of the hospital. "Do you smell that?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. Ethan sniffed the air, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, what is that? It smells like ... like dirt or something." They followed the smell down a narrow hallway that led to a part of the hospital they hadn't explored before. The corridor was darker here, the lights dim and flickering. The smell grew stronger as they approached a set of heavy double doors at the end of the hall. Ethan hesitated for a moment before pushing the doors open. They creaked loudly, echoing down the empty corridor. Beyond the doors was a large, dimly lit room. The smell was overpowering now, and Ethan realized with a jolt that the floor of the room was covered in dirt, thick, dark soil that seemed to have no place in a hospital. "What the hell is this?" Sarah whispered, shining her flashlight around the room. Ethan stepped forward, his shoes sinking slightly into the dirt. The room was filled with strange, old equipment, rusty metal tables, broken down machines, and glass jars filled with murky liquid. It looked like some kind of laboratory, but one that had been abandoned for years. "This must be where they conducted the experiments," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But why is there dirt everywhere?" Sarah didn't answer, her attention drawn to something in the corner of the room. She walked over to it, her flashlight illuminating a small, metal door set into the floor. "Ethan, look at this," she called, kneeling down beside the door. Ethan joined her, and together they examined the door. It was old and rusted, with a heavy padlock securing it shut. The lock was covered in dirt, as if someone had tried to bury it. "This looks like some kind of hatch," Ethan said, trying to pry it open with his fingers. "Maybe it leads to a basement or something," Sarah suggested. "But why would they bury it like this?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to get it open." He pulled a small crowbar from his backpack and wedged it under the padlock, straining with all his strength to break it. After a few moments, the lock snapped, and the hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow set of stone steps leading down into darkness. "Do we really want to go down there?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We have to. Whatever they're hiding, it's down there." They descended the steps cautiously, their flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The air grew colder and more oppressive as they went deeper, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Finally, they reached the bottom, where a narrow tunnel stretched out before them. The tunnel was lined with old stone, damp and covered in moss. It felt ancient, as if it had been there long before the hospital had been built. The dirt smell was stronger here, almost suffocating, and the air was thick with moisture. "Where do you think this leads?" Sarah whispered, her voice echoing in the confined space. "Only one way to find out," Ethan replied, his voice tight with tension. They moved cautiously through the tunnel, the walls pressing in on them from either side. The tunnel twisted and turned, and as they went deeper, the sense of unease grew stronger. There was something down here, something that didn't want them to find it. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a large underground chamber. The chamber was circular, with high arched ceilings that dripped with moisture. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, covered in dark stains that looked like they had been there for decades. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and he quickly shook it, trying to steady the beam. But even in the dim light, he could see that the chamber was filled with strange, arcane symbols carved into the walls and floor. This looks like some kind of ritual chamber," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "But why would this be under a hospital?" Ethan didn't have an answer. His eyes were drawn to the altar, where something glinted in the darkness. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, and reached out to pick it up. It was a small, metal object, cold and heavy in his hand. As he turned it over, he realized it was a key, ancient and worn, with strange symbols etched into the surface. "What do you think it opens?" Sarah asked, peering over his shoulder. "I don't know," Ethan replied, slipping the key into his pocket. "But it must be important. Why else would it be down here?" Before they could investigate further, they heard a sound, a soft, whispering voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the dripping of water, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the chamber. Ethan and Sarah froze, their blood running cold. The voice was speaking in a language they couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, malevolent, filled with a deep, seething hatred. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They turned and fled back down the tunnel, the whispers growing louder and more frantic with each step. The darkness seemed to close in around them, and for a moment, Ethan was sure he felt something brush against his arm, something cold and clammy, like the touch of a dead hand. They reached the stairs and scrambled up them, not stopping until they were back in the dirt-filled room. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the whispers, but the feeling of dread lingered. "We need to leave now," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't argue. They hurried out of the hospital, their hearts racing, and didn't stop until they were far from the building. Only then did they pause to catch their breath, their minds reeling from what they had just experienced. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Ethan replied, his mind racing. "But whatever it was, it's connected to the hospital, and it's dangerous." They walked back to Ethan's house in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally arrived, Ethan pulled the key out of his pocket and stared at it, the strange symbols glinting in the moonlight. "We need to figure out what this key opens," he said, his voice determined. "It might be the only way to stop whatever's happening." Sarah nodded, though her expression was trouble. "But Ethan, what if we're getting in over our heads? What if this is bigger than just finding Liam?" Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with resolve. "It might be. But I can't stop now, Sarah. I need to know the truth, and I need to find my brother." Sarah sighed, but she knew there was no changing his mind. "Okay, we'll figure this out together, but promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise he could keep. As they parted ways for the night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something terrible, something that had been buried in the dark corners of Winterfell Hospital for far too long. And now they had unwittingly brought it to the surface. The next day, Ethan awoke with a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. His dreams had been filled with dark tunnels, whispering voices, and shadowy figures that lurked just beyond the edge of his vision. He hadn't slept well, and as he dragged himself out of bed, he felt a lingering sense of dread. The key he and Sarah had found the night before sat on his desk, its strange symbols gleaming faintly in the morning light. Ethan picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The metal was cold to the touch, and the symbols' intricate, looping designs seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. "What do you unlock?" Ethan muttered to himself, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had spent hours the previous night researching ancient symbols and languages, but he hadn't been able to find anything that matched the designs on the key. It was as if the symbols belonged to a language that had been lost to time, something ancient and forgotten. Ethan's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. *, meet me at the library after school. We need to talk. *. Ethan quickly got ready and headed to school, the key safely tucked in his pocket. The day passed in a blur, his mind too preoccupied to focus on his classes. By the time the final bell rang, he was more than ready to meet up with Sarah and continue their investigation. Sarah pushed one of the books toward him. It was an old, leather-bound volume, its pages yellow with age. The title, *, The Arcane Arts, an exploration of ancient rituals and symbols, *, was embossed on the cover in faded gold letters. "I found this in the rare books section," Sarah explained. "It's a collection of ancient symbols and their meanings, dating back to the medieval period. Some of them are really similar to the ones on the key." Ethan opened the book, flipping through the pages until he found a section titled *, Runes and Sigils of the Occult *. The page was filled with symbols, each accompanied by a brief description of its meaning and origin. As he scanned the page, his eyes widened when he found a symbol that closely resembled the ones on the key. "This one," Ethan said, pointing to the symbol. "It looks almost identical." Sarah leaned over to look. "You're right. But what does it mean? Ethan read the description aloud. Asterisk, the sigil of the Edric, used in rituals to bind and control entities from beyond the mortal realm. The key to unlocking hidden doors and gateways between worlds. Asterisk. Sarah's eyes widened. Entities from beyond the mortal realm. That sounds ... ominous. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. If this key is connected to those symbols, then maybe it's meant to open something that's been locked away for a long time. But what? And why would it be in a hospital? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Ethan shook his head. I don't know. But if this key really does unlock something, then we need to find out what it is before anyone else does. They spent the next few hours poring over the book, trying to find more information about the symbols and their connection to Winterfell Hospital. The book contained references to ancient rituals, secret societies, and arcane knowledge passed down through the ages. But there was little concrete information about the key itself, or what it might unlock. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan and Sarah grew increasingly frustrated. They had uncovered bits and pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. We're missing something, Ethan said, rubbing his temples. There's got to be more to this than just symbols and rituals. There has to be a connection to the hospital, to Leon. Maybe we're looking in the wrong place, Sarah suggested. The hospital was built in the early 1900s, but these symbols are much older. What if the key is connected to something older than the hospital itself? Ethan considered this, his thoughts turning back to the underground chamber they had found. The tunnels, he said suddenly. The tunnels under the hospital, they felt ancient, like they were there long before the hospital was built. What if the key opens something down there? Sarah's eyes lit up with realization. You might be right. The hospital could have been built on top of something older, something they wanted to keep hidden. Ethan's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. We need to go back. We need to explore those tunnels again, find out what the key opens. Sarah hesitated, her expression worried. Are you sure? After what happened last night, ... Those whispers, the feeling that something was down there. I'm not sure if it's safe. Ethan knew she was right. The tunnels had been terrifying, and whatever was down there was dangerous. But he also knew that they couldn't turn back now. They were too close to the truth. We'll be careful, Ethan said, trying to sound confident. But we have to do this, Sarah. For Leon, Sarah sighed, but she nodded. Okay, but we need to be prepared this time. No rushing in blindly. Ethan agreed, and they spent the next hour planning their return to Winterfell Hospital. They gathered supplies, flashlights, extra batteries, a map of the hospital's layout, and a few other tools they thought might come in handy. As they walked out of the library, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town. The air was cool, and a light breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. It was the kind of evening that would have been peaceful under different circumstances, but for Ethan and Sarah, it was filled with tension. When they arrived at the hospital, it was already dark. The building loomed ahead of them, its windows dark and its stone facade casting long, eerie shadows. They approached cautiously, making sure they weren't being watched, and slipped inside through the same door they had used the night before. The hospital was just as silent and oppressive as it had been during their last visit. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the light seemed magnified in the stillness. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as they made their way back to the east wing, toward the hidden tunnel. They reached the dirt-filled room without incident, and Ethan quickly found the hatch they had discovered earlier. He crouched down and shone his flashlight on the metal door, the strange symbols carved into its surface glinting in the light. This is it, Ethan said, pulling the key out of his pocket. Let's see if it works. Sarah stood beside him, her flashlight trained on the hatch. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his hand trembling slightly as he inserted the key into the lock. The metal was cold and unyielding, but with a firm twist, The lock clicked open. Ethan and Sarah exchanged a nervous glance before Ethan pulled the hatch open, revealing the stone steps leading down into darkness. "Here we go," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. They descended the steps cautiously, their flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The air was damp and musty, and the tunnel walls seemed to close in around them as they moved deeper into the earth. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves once again in the narrow, ancient tunnel. The air was heavy, filled with the same oppressive sense of dread they had felt the night before. But this time, there was something else, a faint, rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse through the walls. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, straining to identify the sound. It was low and deep, like the distant beating of a drum, but there was something unnatural about it, something that made his skin crawl. They followed the sound down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper and deeper into the earth, until finally they reached the underground chamber once more. The chamber was just as they had left it, with the stone altar at its center and the strange symbols carved into the walls. But there was something different this time, something that made Ethan's blood run cold. In the center of the altar, where the key had been the night before, there was now a large, ancient chest. It was made of dark, weathered wood bound with iron bands that were etched with the same symbols as the key. Ethan approached the chest cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The rhythmic sound was louder now, pulsing through the chamber, as if the very walls were alive. "This must be what the key unlocks," Ethan said, his voice trembling with both fear and anticipation. Sarah stood beside him, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Are you sure we should open it?" Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the chest. Every instinct told him to turn back, to leave this place, and never return. But something deeper, need for answers, for closure, drove him forward. "We have to," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "We need to know what's inside." With trembling hands, he inserted the key into the chest's lock and turned it. The lock clicked open, and the iron bands loosened, creaking as the chest slowly opened. As the lid lifted, a foul, musty smell wafted out, and Ethan had to suppress a gag. He shone his flashlight inside, revealing the contents of the chest. Inside were old, crumbling papers, bound together in a leather cover. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink had faded, but the symbols on the cover were unmistakable. They were the same as those on the key. Ethan carefully lifted the papers out of the chest, handling them as gently as possible. "It's some kind of journal," he said, flipping open the cover. Sarah peered over his shoulder as he began to read the first page. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to decipher, but after a moment, they began to make out the words. The journal was written by Dr. Alistair Blackwood, the same man they had read about in the library. The entries were dated from the 1940s and detailed his experiments at Winterfell Hospital. As they read, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Dr. Blackwood had been obsessed with the idea of unlocking the full potential of the human mind, of transcending the boundaries of consciousness and opening gateways to other realms. His experiments involved patients from the hospital, many of whom were subjected to unspeakable horrors in the name of science. But what was even more disturbing was the realization that Dr. Blackwood's experiments had not been a failure. They had succeeded. He had managed to open a gateway to another realm, one inhabited by malevolent entities that fed on human fear and suffering. The journal described how these entities had been bound to the hospital using the ancient symbols and rituals that Dr. Blackwood had uncovered in his research. The key, the chest, and the underground chamber were all part of this dark ritual, a way to control and contain the entities. But something had gone wrong. The final entry in the journal was hastily scrawled, filled with fear and desperation. Dr. Blackwood had lost control of the entities, and they had begun to spread beyond the hospital, infecting the minds of the patients and staff. The hospital had been built on top of the gateway, a vain attempt to seal the breach, but the entities had remained, growing stronger over the decades. Ethan and Sarah stared at the final entry, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The implications of what they had just read were terrifying. "This is why Liam disappeared," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entities ... they took him." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "And they're still here, still feeding on the fear and suffering of the patients." Ethan closed the journal, his hands trembling. "We need to destroy this place. We need to close the gateway for good." "But how?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with dread. "If Dr. Blackwood couldn't control them, how can we?" Ethan didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they couldn't leave things as they were. They had to find a way to stop the entities, to save Liam and the others who were trapped in the hospital's dark grip. As they turned to leave the chamber, the rhythmic sound that had been pulsing through the walls suddenly grew louder, more intense. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and the air filled with a low, rumbling noise. Ethan and Sarah exchanged a terrified glance. Whatever was happening, it was coming from the depths of the tunnel, the same tunnel they had used to enter the chamber. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said urgently, grabbing Ethan's arm. Ethan nodded, clutching the journal tightly. They ran back down the tunnel, the rumbling growing louder and more violent with each step. The walls shook, and chunks of stone began to fall from the ceiling, filling the air with dust and debris. As they reached the stairs, the ground heaved beneath them, and the tunnel began to collapse. Ethan and Sarah scrambled up the steps, their hearts pounding with fear. They burst through the hatch, slamming it shut behind them as the tunnel collapsed entirely, sealing off the underground chamber. The hospital above them was still intact, but the floor beneath them continued to tremble, as if the very earth was trying to expel something from its depths. Ethan and Sarah didn't stop to catch their breath. They ran through the hospital, the walls closing in around them as the building groaned and creaked under the pressure. The lights flickered, and shadows danced across the walls, twisting into terrifying shapes. When they finally burst out of the hospital's main entrance, the night air hit them like a cold shock. They stumbled out onto the street, gasping for breath, their hearts still racing. The hospital loomed behind them, dark and silent once more. But Ethan knew that whatever they had uncovered in the tunnels was far from over. "We need to go to the authorities," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We need to tell them what we found." Ethan nodded, though he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The authorities might not believe them, and even if they did, they wouldn't know how to deal with something as ancient and powerful as the entities Dr. Blackwood had unleashed. But they had to try. They had to find a way to stop the entities, to close the gateway and save the hospital's remaining patients, including Liam. As they walked away from Winterfell Hospital, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch up toward them, as if the darkness itself was alive and aware of their presence, and somewhere deep beneath the earth, in the collapsed tunnels and forgotten chambers, something stirred, something ancient and malevolent, awakened by their intrusion and hungry for revenge. Ethan and Sarah hurried away from Winterfell Hospital, their thoughts a tangled mess of fear and determination. They knew they had uncovered something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated, something that had the power to destroy not just the hospital, but everyone connected to it. As they reached the edge of town, they stopped to catch their breath. The air was crisp and cold, and the sky above them was filled with stars, a stark contrast to the darkness they had just escaped. "We can't just go to the authorities," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. "They won't believe us, and even if they did, they wouldn't know how to stop it." Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "But what can we do? We can't go back in there without a plan. Whatever those things are, they're too powerful." Ethan thought back to the journal they had found, the ancient rituals and symbols, the desperate attempts of Dr. Blackwood to contain the entities. There had to be something in there, some way to seal the gateway and stop the entities from escaping. "We need to figure out how to close the gateway," Ethan said, his mind racing. Dr. Blackwood couldn't control them, but maybe we can find a way to undo what he did. Sarah hesitated, her expression filled with doubt. "You really think we can do this, that we can succeed where he failed?" "We have to try," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "If we don't, those things will keep spreading. Liam's life depends on it, and so do the lives of everyone in that hospital." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Okay, let's do this, but we need to be smart about it. We can't just rush back in there without a plan." They returned to Ethan's house, where they spent the next few hours poring over the journal, searching for any clues that might help them. The journal was filled with references to ancient rituals, symbols, and incantations, but much of it was written in a language they couldn't understand. As they worked, the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. The tension was palpable, and the sense of urgency grew with each passing minute. Finally, Ethan found something that seemed promising, a section of the journal that detailed a ritual meant to close the gateway and banish the entities back to their own realm. The ritual involved the use of the same symbols they had seen in the underground chamber, along with a series of incantations that had to be spoken in a specific order. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "This is how we close the gateway." Sarah leaned over to read the passage, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of the instructions. "But it says here that the ritual requires a sacrifice." "A life." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "A life? Whose life?" "The journal doesn't say," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "But it mentions that the sacrifice has to be willing, someone who understands the consequences and is willing to give up everything to seal the gateway." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to process what this meant. Was he supposed to sacrifice himself? Was that the only way to save Liam and the others? Sarah seemed to read his thoughts. "Ethan, you can't do this. We have to find another way." "But what if there isn't another way?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with desperation. "What if this is the only way to stop them?" Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, there has to be another way. We can figure this out together. But I can't let you sacrifice yourself." Ethan looked at her, his heart aching at the thought of leaving her behind. But he knew that if it came down to it, he would do whatever it took to save Liam, even if it meant giving up his own life. "We'll figure it out," Ethan said, trying to reassure her. "But we need to be prepared for anything. We can't let them win." Sarah nodded, though her expression was filled with worry. "Just promise me you won't do anything reckless." "I promise," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise he could keep. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Sarah made their way back to Winterfell Hospital. The building loomed ahead of them, dark and foreboding, like a giant waiting to swallow them whole. They had brought the journal with them, along with a few supplies they thought might be useful: candles, chalk, and a small knife that had belonged to Ethan's father. The knife was old, its blade tarnished with age, but it was sharp enough to be dangerous. The hospital was silent as they entered, the air thick with the same oppressive sense of dread that had haunted them the night before. They moved quickly, making their way back to the east wing, where the underground chamber awaited them. When they reached the dirt-filled room, Ethan hesitated for a moment before opening the hatch. The tunnel below was still dark, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. But they had no choice. They had to go back down. They descended the stairs cautiously, their flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The tunnel was just as narrow and claustrophobic as before, and every sound seemed to echo off the walls, magnifying their fear. When they reached the underground chamber, the rhythmic sound they had heard the night before had returned, louder and more insistent. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Ethan and Sarah moved quickly, setting up the ritual as described in the journal. They drew the symbols on the floor with chalk, placed the candles around the altar, and lit them, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the chamber. As they worked, the rhythmic sound grew louder, almost deafening, as if the very walls were alive with the entity's rage. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air was filled with a low, rumbling noise that made their hearts pound with fear. Ethan opened the journal to the page with the incantations, his hands shaking as he began to read aloud. The words were unfamiliar, twisted and guttural, and they seemed to hang in the air as if the very atmosphere was absorbing their power. As he spoke, the symbols on the floor began to glow faintly at first, but growing brighter with each word. The candles flickered, their flames dancing wildly, and the air grew colder, as if the chamber was being drained of all warmth. Ethan's voice trembled as he reached the final incantation, the words catching in his throat. The journal had warned that this was the most dangerous part of the ritual, the moment when the entities would be at their most powerful, desperate to break free from their bindings. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible over the deafening noise. Sarah nodded, though her face was pale with fear. "Just do it, Ethan. Finish it." Ethan took a deep breath and spoke the final words of the incantation. The symbols on the floor flared to life, blazing with a blinding light that filled the chamber. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the air was filled with a piercing scream, a scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The entities were fighting back, desperate to escape the ritual's power. Ethan could feel their rage, their hatred, as if it were a physical force pressing down on him, trying to crush him. But he couldn't stop now. He had to finish the ritual, no matter the cost. With a final, trembling breath, Ethan reached for the knife. The journal had warned that the sacrifice would be necessary, to this point a willing sacrifice to seal the gateway and banish the entities. "Ethan, no," Sarah cried, realizing what he was about to do. Ethan hesitated, the knife hovering over his palm. He didn't want to die, he was terrified of what lay beyond. But if it meant saving Liam, saving Sarah, and stopping the entities, he knew he had to do it. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I have to." But before he could make the cut, Sarah grabbed his hand, stopping him. "No, Ethan, there's got to be another way. We can do this together. Please don't do this." Ethan looked into her tear-filled eyes, his heart breaking. But in that moment, something shifted, a realization that maybe, just maybe, they could find another way. Suddenly, the journal began to glow, its pages turning on their own as if guided by an unseen force. The symbols on the page began to rearrange themselves, forming new patterns, new instructions. Ethan stared at the journal, his mind racing. The journal was showing them another way, another path that didn't require a life to be sacrificed. "Sarah, look," Ethan said, his voice filled with hope. Sarah glanced at the glowing journal, her eyes widening. It's changing. The ritual, it's different now." Ethan quickly began to read the new instructions, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The ritual had changed. It no longer required a blood sacrifice. Instead, it required the invocation of the entity's true names, binding them back to their realm. Ethan and Sarah worked quickly, following the new instructions. They chanted the names as they were revealed to them, their voices growing stronger as they felt the ritual taking hold. The ground beneath them trembled, but this time it felt different, like a shifting, a rearranging of the very fabric of the chamber. The symbols on the floor pulsed with light, and the air was filled with a sense of anticipation. as if the chamber itself was holding its breath. With the final incantation, the light flared one last time, filling the chamber with a brilliant, blinding radiance. The rhythmic sound that had filled the air abruptly stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. The ground stopped shaking, and the oppressive presence that had weighed down on them vanished, leaving the air feeling lighter, freer. Ethan and Sarah stood there, panting, their hearts racing. The chamber was quiet now, the symbols on the floor dimming to a soft, pulsing glow. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it," Ethan nodded, tears of relief filling his eyes. The gateway had sealed, but as they stood there, a low, groaning noise echoed through the chamber. The walls began to crack, the ceiling trembling as the ancient structure started to collapse in on itself. "We need to get out of here," Ethan shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. They sprinted back through the tunnel, the ground shaking beneath them as the chamber collapsed. Dust and debris rained down around them, but they didn't stop until they burst out of the hospital's entrance, stumbling into the cold night air. Behind them, Winterfell Hospital groaned and shuddered, the ancient building finally giving way under the strain of what had just occurred. The ground beneath it cracked open, swallowing the building whole as the earth itself seemed to close around the sealed gateway. Ethan and Sarah watched in stunned silence as the hospital disappeared into the ground, leaving nothing but a gaping hole where it had once stood. "It's over," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her hand still tightly gripping his. "It's over." But as they turned to leave, a soft, familiar voice called out from the darkness, "Ethan." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he turned around, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing at the edge of the collapse, was Liam. "Liam," Ethan cried, running toward him. Liam looked different, his eyes were no longer hollow, and his face no longer gaunt. He looked whole, as if the darkness that had consumed him had finally let go. "Ethan," Liam said again, his voice soft and filled with gratitude, "you saved me." Ethan threw his arms around his brother, tears streaming down his face. "I thought I'd lost you, Liam." Liam hugged him back, his voice choked with emotion. "You didn't, you brought me back." As they stood there, reunited at last, Sarah joined them, a smile of relief on her face. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and joy. Ethan nodded, wiping the tears from his eyes. "Yeah, we did." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the three of them stood together, watching as the sun rose on a new day, a day free from the darkness that had once consumed Winterfell Hospital. The nightmare was over, the entities were sealed, the gateway closed, and the hospital, a symbol of the town's darkest secrets, was gone. But in its place, a new hope had emerged, a hope that no matter how dark things became, there was always a way to bring light back into the world. And as they walked away from the ruins of Winterfell Hospital, Ethan knew that they had not only saved Liam, but they had also saved themselves from the shadows that had once threatened to consume them all.